The air in northern France on the morning of March 26, 1916, has a damp, biting cold that doesn't sit on your skin. It sinks into the marrow and stays there. The sky isn't fully light yet. It's just less dark. And Private Fortunat Auger has been awake for hours. He is 25 years old, an architect from Montreal, a man who in another life would have been measuring door frames and drawing clean lines onto clean paper. In this life, he lies on a canvas stretcher in a borrowed hut that smells of wet wool and old smoke, staring at a ceiling that he won't see again after today. Auger belongs to the 14th Battalion, the Royal Montreal Regiment. And what makes this particular morning sharper, colder, and heavier, Fortunat Auger will be the first Canadian soldier executed in the First World War. He is not a stranger to the path that brought him here. The army had pulled him back from the edge before. Suspended sentences, leniency, second chances, signed by officers who still believed that discipline could be restored without blood. But the file thickened. Charges for being absent, then outright desertion. More than once. While other men stayed in the trenches, Auger vanished from them, abandoning not only his duties, but his comrades. Then January came, and his unit moved toward the front, and Auger disappeared for 9 days. 9 days in a war where hours matter. 9 days where his comrades served, were terrified, and some died. They did their duty, while Auger had deserted again. And that was the act that finally exhausted whatever patience remained. A field general court-martial decreed maximum punishment, and eventually it was signed off by the commander-in-chief himself, Haig. Near midnight, a chaplain arrives, kind in the practiced way of a man who has learned how to help ease the dying into the next chapter. He speaks softly. He offers prayer, not because it will change anything, but because it is the only comfort the system has left to give. Before first light, the camp begins to stir. Boots, buckles, metal touching metal. The quiet of the routine is worse than the shouting. It means everyone knows what to do. A corporal opens the door, eyes forward. It's time. They lead Auger out into the gray, pre-dawn mist to a patch of ground set aside for this purpose. A solitary wooden post is already waiting. And so is the firing party. 10 of Auger's fellow RMR soldiers. Men who may have shared his billet or served beside him in the trenches. Men who wore the same distinguishing badge of the regiment, the same number 14 as their unit identifier. Their rifles are loaded with a mix of live and dummy rounds, a mechanical mercy designed so that no one can know for sure if he fired the fatal shot. An officer steps forward with a paper and reads the formal words that turn a living man into an example. The words of command are given firmly. Rifles are raised to the shoulder. Ready! Metallic clicks echo as 10 safety catches are flicked off. Aim! 10 barrels of high-powered rifles point at Auger's chest. And then, exactly at 5:43 a.m., fire! One volley. A brief, brutal sound in the cold. Auger slumps against the restraints. A medical officer checks him, nods, and the process closes itself. Soon, his name and his crime will be read aloud to the assembled troops, not as remembrance, but as a warning to the men who will return to the mud. Then routine returns to the ordinary. The smells of the cookhouse, bacon, tea, and bread drifting into the cold air beckon. A kindly NCO takes the firing party aside for an extra rum ration, a small mercy for an unenviable task. NCOs begin detailing the men into their work parties for the day. Life of the battalion returns to normal. Unit cohesion begins to heal.
That was quite striking, Colin. It really gets into you. when you read something like that, when you hear something like that. Welcome back to the Rum Ration podcast. I'm Rejoy, joined as always by podcasting battle buddy Colin. We're both former Army Reserve officers who spent most of our lives obsessed with the stories of the folks in the mud. Now, today, we're looking at a chapter of military history that is often whispered about but rarely understood in its full, messy context. The soldiers of the Canadian Expeditionary Force who were, quote, shot at dawn, unquote.
It's a heavy one, Rejoy, and we're going to probably dispense with our usual banter that we're renowned for here.
Yes.
And when we talk about World War I, we usually talk proudly about the birth of a nation. We talk about Vimy, the sacrifices at Passchendaele, the last 100 Days campaign. And we talk about the 650,000 Canadians serving in the war to end all wars. But within that massive citizen army, there's a smaller, darker statistic. 25 Canadian volunteers were executed by their own side.
And that's not something that one hears about very often or is talked about openly. There's a modern tendency to view these men as pure shell-shocked victims.
Mm-hmm.
Well, certainly some were. The archival reality is a little bit more complicated, and I think the way you phrased it in your intro was very apt about doing one's duty and carrying through when some did and some didn't. These were often repeat offenders, as in the case of Auger, men who had been given multiple chances and had their sentences commuted again, like Auger, and were fully aware that their next flight from the trenches could be their last.
Exactly. And I think it's also important just right from the start to dispense with this cinematic propaganda view of the generals and their chateaus, miles and miles away from the front line, untouched and cold-heartedly just having been shot at random. Now, you mentioned it, that these were repeat offenders. We mentioned it in the intro. Auger had already been charged with desertion more than once, and then he was finally executed. So this wasn't just some poor gibbering fool who was suffering from shell shock that was cruelly pulled aside and shot, which is often kind of the way it's
portrayed.
Portrayed, yeah. So I think to understand why a country would execute its own volunteers, we have to look at the legal framework that they were operating under. What was the actual purpose of military law back then?
Well, the sources are clear. Military law wasn't built to deliver justice in the way a civilian court is. And I think that's where a lot of people mix things up. This is a completely different society. As the Manual of Military Law stated at the time, its object was purely to maintain discipline.
Discipline. That's the key word.
Exactly. That is the key word right there. In a civilian world, you can't be tried for having rusty tools or talking back to your boss or, things like that. But in the infantry, those are the building blocks of order.
Yes, and it's that infantry lens that we always talk about. And yes, before you write in to complain, we know we're biased. We don't pretend to not be.
No.
The thinking in World War I was that the discipline has to be public, because if a soldier thinks that fleeing combat is safer than staying to do his duty, there's no inducement for him to actually stay and fight. So the death penalty was seen by the high command as a necessary deterrent. It was about the collective and not the individual.
And, again, anybody who has served in any capacity knows that it's about the collective and not the individual. And especially in the infantry, when, as we both know, when you're being trained, the first thing is if you don't react, if you don't do what you're trained to do, your buddy will die.
Suffer, yeah.
And that's on you. So it is very much about the collective. I have to say, speaking of bias, as proud former members of the Royal Montreal Regiment, our beloved regiment, we're going to focus today on one specific man whose story perfectly captures this tension. Private Fortunat Auger.
Yeah, Auger is a fascinating starting point because he wasn't a conscript, wasn't forced against his will. He wasn't a victim, forced into the army, dragged kicking and screaming. He had agency. He was a French Canadian, just to keep chipping away at all these myths.
Yeah.
He was a volunteer from Montreal, an architect and carpenter by trade.
Educated.
He signed his attestation papers in Valcartier in September 1914. So right at the beginning, an educated French Canadian volunteered.
Yep.
He was 23 years old when he signed up. He was only 5'4" and he had a scar over his left eyebrow. Just an ordinary guy who stepped up to be part of the great adventure of war.
Yeah. But once he got to Europe with the 14th Battalion, the extraordinary circumstances of the war began to grind him down. Again, a case of you sign up for something without really
Yeah,
understanding
well, nobody
what you're
knew,
getting
right?
into. Nobody
Yeah.
knew.
Yeah. And Auger didn't start off as a deserter. He was there for the heavy lifting in 1915. We're not trying to say he was shirking his duty at all times. He was there for the Second Battle of Ypres, which we've covered extensively in previous episodes about the gas attacks and the horror.
Yeah.
We covered it really at length in episode 11. And then you had the Battle of Festubert, where the RMR took huge losses. These were the early chaotic days where the Canadian Expeditionary Force was learning about the lethality of modern war. They were learning it the hard way.
Oh, absolutely. There's a theory mentioned in the sources by historians like Desmond Morton, the very famous, well-known Canadian military historian, echoing Lord Morin, that courage is a finite resource. And, I can really understand the
Yeah.
phrasing of that. I think that's beautifully put.
I
It is
agree.
a finite resource. You have a certain amount in the bank, and every hour of immobility under artillery fire drains it. Well, for Auger, the drain started early.
What do we see in his conduct record during that first year in the field?
It starts with belligerence, which is not surprising because there are so many of these episodes where it starts with this aggression, right? This belligerence. So after the RMR moved to Plugsteert Wood, or as the Brits called it, Plug Street,
Plug Street.
right? Plug Street
Yeah.
Wood. In the summer of 1915, his conduct sheet starts filling up.
Yeah.
So that's relatively quickly.
Yeah.
He was charged twice with being absent without leave, AWOL. In May 1915, soon after the Second Battle of Ypres and the gas attacks, he was absent from the trenches for 2 days.
Yeah.
2 days.
Yeah, I guess he got his taste of what real modern war was like at the Second Battle of Ypres and said, yeah, I'm good.
Yeah. Yeah.
But from an infantry officer's perspective, an absence from the trench isn't just a paperwork error. It means your section's short a rifle. It means the guy next to you is pulling double watch because someone's got to stand up and do sentry duty. It's uniformly seen up and down the ranks as an entirely unacceptable behavior.
And I think it's fair to say, if you were able to examine the records at the time and diaries and things like that, the troops that are holding the line, that are there, they're not particularly sympathetic to this type of behavior at all.
No.
They're the ones who are paid for it.
Misconception, yeah.
Exactly. There's no sympathy there. It's like,
No.
what the hell is going on? They're still there. They're still holding a line. They're still doing their duty. And as you rightly pointed out, Colin, your section is short a rifle. And that's a huge thing. If you go back and listen to our episodes on the Battle of Ypres, every rifle counted, every
Absolutely.
round counted. And now here's this guy who suddenly says, you know what? I'm not doing it anymore. Yeah, I'm gone. So Auger's offenses weren't isolated. He went absent again in November 1915 for 4 days. By December 1915, he disappeared for 2 days and was finally charged with desertion.
Finally charged. Finally. That means they've been pretty lenient up to then.
Extremely lenient.
Now, at this point, the military had options other than a firing squad. And what were the lesser punishments that they were using to try and get them back in line?
Yeah, the army had changed quite a bit by this point. So flogging had been abolished in 1881 through the Army Act of the same year. But they had other punishments that replaced it, such as what men called crucifixion.
Lovely.
Yes, it's a good term for what would follow. Officially known as field punishment number 1. So this meant being attached to a fixed object like a wagon wheel or a post for 2 hours a day. It was meant to be public and humiliating. That was the reasoning behind it. Auger was also sentenced to 12 months of hard labor.
But here's a twist that challenges the brutal general's narrative. The military actually showed him leniency. His 12-month sentence was suspended after only a month, and he was returned to his unit.
Let's also not forget that while he is going AWOL, it's not like his battalion is sitting there doing nothing. They're in the line.
Right.
There are guys dying
Yeah.
all throughout that time period. They wanted him back in the line. I mean, everybody counted. Every rifle counted. They gave him a chance to wipe the slate clean. And that's where the story takes its most tragic turn.
Yeah, Auger is returned to the RMR after his suspended sentence, and he immediately leaves again. Just days later, in January
Incredible.
1916, he disappeared for 9 days while his unit was on its way up to the front line.
It's crazy. It's
Yeah,
crazy.
and he was
Return.
determined.
Yes, he's not going to stick around. Doesn't matter what the rest of his buddies do. He's not going to be a part of it. Uh, and this is the catalyst for the end. He's arrested on January 11th and faced a field general court martial on March 15th, 1916. And again, if you look at those dates, that's 2 months
Hmm.
pretty much that he's in safety
Hmm.
out of the front line,
Yeah.
not contributing,
Yep.
not at the stand to in the mornings and the stand on the evenings, not taking part in trench raids as his
Not
comrades
doing
are
the
doing.
wiring parties, not carrying rations up, I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
But let's look at the trial process, and people might imagine a star chamber where there was, everything was loaded against him, but there was a specific structure, wasn't there?
It was a panel of officers,
Right.
definitely a specific structure. And the accused had a prisoner's friend, not exactly a defense lawyer, but typically a junior officer with no legal training. I think in certain cases, you and I have
Yeah. Yeah.
carried out the same in our units. I'm sure we both have memories of those times. We
Yeah.
obviously do because I'm bringing it up.
Yeah.
Um, but nothing for this, this
Nothing.
serious.
Nothing.
Nothing.
I
Nothing
wasn't
that.
assisting
No.
officer for anyone who tried with
No,
desertion.
no, nothing like
Punching a
that.
master
Uh,
corporal. Yes.
well, yes, but the odds here were very heavy. In Auger's case, he had a record of 3 previous
Yeah.
absences and a suspended death sentence for a previous desertion.
Hold on a minute. He'd already been found convicted, guilty, and given a death
Suspended,
sentence.
but
Already been
suspended.
given. Okay, so this is going to be his second death sentence. Okay.
Second death sentence. So again, going back to what you had said earlier on about the leniency
Yeah.
and not being cinematic about it. I mean, this is how hard the military tried to rehabilitate this man.
Yeah. And for selfish reasons too. I mean, they wanted,
Sure.
if they could
Yeah.
get him back and being functional, that's one
Yeah.
less person they have to recruit and all that kind of stuff and train.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. We're not going to sugarcoat anything, but
Yeah.
but this
It's
is
it's
a fact.
it's in their best interest if they can get him back to the front
Yes.
line and doing his job. Yeah.
Yes.
Now the sources don't detail his specific defense statement, even if he gave one. But we know that in these trials, the accused rarely gave long statements.
Yeah. But what the court did look at was his conduct sheet. And Auger's sheet was a map of a man who had decided he was done fighting.
Yeah.
He was over it. He had admitted to evading 2 tours of duty in the trenches. So he openly said, "Yeah, I wasn't there."
And we have to consider the battalion commander's position here. Auger was in the 14th Battalion, and along with the
Yeah.
22nd Battalion, these two units accounted for a disproportionate number of disobedience and death sentences in the Canadian Expeditionary Force.
Colin, why was that though? Was it just a hard-ass commander? Was it a bias against French Canadians?
Yeah, we had
you know?
talked about that with Richard Garron, if you remember, about that bias, and he kind of exploded that myth
Yeah.
a bit. But so not really, I guess, is the short answer. It seems convenient for, like, I know when I first saw the stats, I went, what do the RMR and the Vandus have in common? A heavy proportion of French Canadian soldiers, right?
Yeah.
But some historians do point to Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Louis Tremblay of the Vandus, who wanted to purge his unit of, quote, tramps and ne'er-do-wells, end quote. And they felt if repeat offenders were allowed to keep walking away, the morale of the brave men who stayed would collapse.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Miller problem from
Mhm.
Frederick Manning's novel Her Private's We, which is a great read. The men in the unit often had the swiftest judgment, and well, again, for anybody who's been in an infantry unit, you know that they were the ones going through the hell. While as we kind of said, this is where the deserter kind of saved his skin, so to speak, right? And about her Private Suite, for anyone unfamiliar with the novel, it's one of those iconic First World War books, often ranked alongside All Quiet on the Western Front. And her Private Suite follows a group of British infantrymen as they march to the line, endure trench life, go into battle on the Western Front. Its real subject is not strategy or glory, but the inner life of ordinary soldiers. The everyday things, their humor, the exhaustion that they felt, the comradeship that they took comfort in, and the quiet confrontation with death on a daily basis.
Yeah, I've not read that one, but I will definitely put it on my list.
It's quite something. I read it
Well,
years and years ago, so I don't remember very much of it,
mm.
but it is one of those books.
Auger was found guilty. In a capital case, the sentence of death had to be unanimous amongst the officers on the panel. They signed the paper, but the trial itself wasn't the final word.
No, here's the thing. Every death sentence had to be confirmed by the Commander-in-Chief, Sir Douglas Haig. This is where the story of military justice gets really strange.
Yeah, because it wasn't a guarantee of execution. Just because you'd been sentenced to death didn't mean you were actually going to get shot at dawn. The stats are actually kind of shocking when you look at them.
It's quite amazing. Out of 203 death sentences for desertion in the CEF, only 22 were actually carried out. 22 out of
Yeah.
203. That's saying something. Means 181 men were found guilty, sentenced to die, and then they weren't executed.
Yeah, I believe overall throughout the entire colonial British forces, because the Australians refused to execute any of their own. But for everyone else, I think there's something like 3,000 that were recommended for execution, and only 10%, well, only, but 10% were actually carried out. It was very, very strict across all nationalities. So, Scottish, Welsh, Irish, English, Canadian, whatever it was. It was, Haig stuck to basically decimation, like a 1 in 10.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what saved them? Because we see cases like Arthur Lemay, who was a 3-time deserter, 3 times from the 22nd Battalion, the Vendus, and his own commanders recommended execution. The court sentenced him to death, and then Haig inexplicably commuted it to penal servitude. Lemay lived.
Yeah. So why not Auger? Why was his sentence confirmed?
Well, this is where the term bureaucratic decimation, which refers to an implicit policy during the First World War, where approximately 1 in every 10 men condemned to death by a court-martial actually had their sentence confirmed and carried out. So it came down to timing and discipline. I guess maybe Auger was right after the 9th file that had come through across Haig's desk, and he was number 10. Yeah. Executions often spiked before major offensives or in sectors where discipline was perceived to be failing. And so Auger was the first Canadian to be executed, and the authorities felt a serious example was necessary. His previous suspended sentence actually worked against him. It showed that leniency hadn't worked.
Yeah, you can see the logic behind that. Once Haig signed that paper, well, the clock started. Auger was informed his plea for mercy was rejected.
Can you imagine that night? The sources described the routine. A condemned man spent his final hours with a military chaplain.
Yeah.
They were often given a final meal, sometimes a ration of rum, the infamous Rum Ration that gives our show its name.
Yeah. And then, as the story goes, at dawn, they were let out. The firing squad was usually made up of 10 to 12 soldiers from their own unit.
That's a detail that always gets to me as a former infantryman. If you're ordering soldiers to shoot a man that they might have shared a billet with, one of their buddies. And to manage the psychological toll, the rifles were loaded with a mix of live and dummy rounds so that no one soldier knew for certain if he'd fired the fatal shot. Yeah. The soldiers weren't given the command to load or ready their weapons. They were just handed already loaded rifles that were readied with the safeties on. So the NCOs would have taken care of that before the firing party showed up. The NCOs would have loaded them and then mixed around the rifles. So apparently nobody knew which one was which. Otherwise, the soldiers would have known who had the blank round and who didn't. And at that short range, it didn't really matter whose rifle they were firing. It didn't matter if it was zero because they were firing from, less than 10 meters. So adjusting the sights wasn't an issue.
Yeah. And so Auger was, as we said, let out at dawn, led to a post at 05:43 a.m. on March 26th, 1916.
After the shots were fired, the name of the executed soldier and his offense were read aloud to the assembled troops. The example was made, and it wasn't just with his own lines, it wasn't just with his own battalion, it wasn't his own brigade, it wasn't just the Canadians. Then the execution was read out in routine orders across the entire British Expeditionary Force and all the other expeditionary forces.
That's that whole idea of
discipline,
making discipline and the example, make an example. But the government back in Canada didn't broadcast this.
No, right? Sir.
For decades, these stories were essentially forgotten or suppressed, and even the families often didn't know the truth.
Quite often. didn't know the truth. And we see that in the case of the World War II of Harold Pringle. He was the last Canadian soldier executed. His family didn't even know. And he had existed for years because of the shame. For the World War I men, they were just names that didn't appear in the local cenotaphs. Like Auger was not in the original RMR Book of Remembrance. His name was never ever read out at our annual ceremony. His name was never read out with his comrades. His death was not counted as part of the hallowed 1192, which is commemorated on the RMR's bronze memorial tablet on the north wall of the armory.
Yeah. Well, that changed in the 1990s. Campaign began to pardon these men. The argument was that the, quote, horrific circumstances, unquote, of the war, what we now call PTSD, but they called shell shock. That's what made these executions well, quote, a stain on the reputation of the army, unquote.
Yeah, in 2001, the Canadian Minister of Veterans Affairs, Ronald Duhamel, stood up in Parliament and entered the names of 23 of these men, including Fortunat Auger, into the Book of Remembrance. He said that we can't comprehend the culture of that time, but we can give them dignity now.
Yeah. And in 2006, the British government issued a full pardon for all 306 Commonwealth soldiers executed for military offenses in World War I. And in 2014, a certain honorary Lieutenant Colonel Robinson recommended to the RMR's Regimental Advisory Council that Auger's name be added to the Roll of Honor in time for the regiment's centennial, which it was.
Thank you. Yeah, I also made the point at the 100th anniversary dinner last November, the 100th anniversary of our armory, which we do have an episode on, of course, to point out that the actual number of the RMR dead in World War I was 1193, not the 1192 that we'd all memorized. Because I was introducing the latest version of the RMR's history book, which the wonderfully illustrated Glory Never Dies, which was written by Alan Hustack and illustrated by Camille Yepoy.
Beautiful
available
book.
For purchase at RoyalMontrealRegiment.com.
Highly recommended. Highly recommended reading.
So where does that leave us, Rejoy? As a former officer, when you look at Auger, a man who volunteered, saw the worst of 1915, and then repeatedly chose to walk away, how do you view him?
You know, it's a complicated thing. There's no black and white here. I think the sources provide a balanced lens as to how you would view him. He wasn't a cold-blooded killer. We talk about that in other episodes, like with winning the Victoria Cross, for example. But he also wasn't an innocent victim of a mistake. You mentioned earlier on, Colin, about shell shock and PTSD. But this is a guy who was not, as you put it, a gibbering shell of a man. He was making very conscious decisions.
Yes.
He wasn't an innocent victim of a mistake. He was, well, to use the language of the time, an incorrigible. A man who had reached his limit and made a conscious choice to stop being a soldier. So it's complicated. I mean, when you look at the history of the time, what they were going through, we covered the battles of Ypres, and it would go on and get, the Somme was to come, and then
it wasn't going to get better.
It wasn't going to get better. Third Battle of Ypres, and then open warfare. It's not going to get, as you said, any better. So it's difficult, but I think for people like us, it goes back to those core values that are instilled in you when you first become a member of the regiment. It's about the collective. It's about, if you don't do what you need to do, somebody else, the guy that you brewed a cup of coffee with, who bound up your superficial wound and got you back up, that guy's going to die. Yeah. So it's hard.
And back then, I mean, these guys were forced to be rubbing whale oil into each other's feet and all this kind of stuff. I mean, there was a big connection, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was real family. Closer than blood ties in many cases.
And the military, they made a conscious choice that the cost to his survival was too high for the morale of the battalion. It was brutal, cold logic. And when you think of that, it means that there was obviously dissension in the ranks. Not that he was going to get executed. I think there was dissension in the ranks that he'd already gotten off.
I think so.
You talked about him making that conscious choice to stop being a soldier. He'd already been found guilty and already sentenced to death and had it commuted. He knew very well what would happen if he went AWOL again.
Yeah. And I think before people get all judgmental about it, they need to sort of think back and put yourself in the other soldier's shoes.
Exactly.
It's not Auger just went off a couple of times. I mean, look at the record.
Yeah.
Over and over and over and over again. And during that time, these men were in the line, facing incredible danger, dying. Many of them were not alive at the time that he was finally executed, but have been alive from the moment he first went AWOL.
Yeah.
So it's it's a brutal cold logic, as you said, and there's a reasoning behind it. So Fortunat Auger is buried in Trois Arbres Cemetery in France, plot 3, row H, grave 5. He was 25 years old. He was an architect who couldn't find a way to build a life out of the trenches.
Yeah, I think one of the redeeming factors of this is where he is buried. There is no difference between his headstone and anyone else's headstone. So I think at least there's that anonymity to it. There's no shame that will continue to stay on. If you're just visiting that, cemetery. If he'd earned a Victoria Cross, it would have a Victoria Cross engraved on it, but it doesn't have a deserter or shot for cowardice, something like that.
There's no shame.
There's no shame in there. He's just every other soldier. So I guess there's a redemption in his death. Because we talked on an earlier episode about Victoria Cross winners, and we remember the Victoria Cross winners for their selflessness, and rightfully so.
Yes.
But there's a different kind of humanity in the stories of the men who broke. They are part of the stories of the Citizen Army too. And sadly, yes, there was a class distinction. There was a Second Battle of Ypres. There was a commanding officer of a Canadian unit who was found dressed as a woman fleeing for the ports. Not the proudest moment, but there were officers executed as well. It wasn't just the men who were suffering here. There was Second Lieutenant Eric Skeffington Poole, who's a Canadian officer who had been treated for shell shock after being injured by a shell explosion in July 1916. He subsequently deserted, was court-martialed, and became the first officer to be executed by a firing squad on December 10th, 1916. So that's only 7 months after. 8 months after Auger. So like they were being pretty serious, and the fact that they were executing officers, Matt, they were not messing around.
Yes, it's a tragic story all around, in so many ways. It's just very, very sad and gives real pause for thought.
Mm-hmm.
So shot at dawn, a reminder that quote, the war to end all wars, unquote, claimed lives in more ways than one.
Thanks for joining us on the Rum Ration podcast. This wasn't a light-hearted episode, so we skipped the usual fantasy sponsor bits. I'm a pretty cold-hearted prick by nature, but even I couldn't write a bit about the Rum Ration podcast is brought to you by Final Dawn Rum. The rum. No, I couldn't do that.
No, we couldn't do that. But we hope you enjoyed the podcast, or at least took something away from it, learned something today. So please like and subscribe and share with anyone you know. And we'll see you in the mud next time.
Cheers, stay straight.